In the summer of 1630, Naples fell silent except for the rumble of death carts and the stench of bodies in the streets. From her window, Maria saw a tall figure in black leather, gloves, and a wide hat. But it was the face that froze her. A long beaked mask, glass eyes, like a bird of death walking upright. This wasn't a demon. It was a plague doctor, the only person allowed to touch the sick and the dead. But behind that terrifying mask was a chilling question. Were they truly healers, or just witnesses to the end? The world Maria was looking at from her window was not just a city in crisis, it was a civilization unraveling. The plague did not move like an ordinary disease. It moved like a shadow cast by death itself, crossing borders, seas, and mountains with terrifying indifference. In just a few years, it erased entire bloodlines, emptied villages, and carved a permanent scar into Europe's memory. Historians would later estimate that between a third and half of Europe's population, tens of millions of people, simply vanished. Not soldiers in a war, not victims of famine, but ordinary men, women, and children who went to bed with a fever and never rose again. Daily life collapsed with shocking speed. Farms went untended, crops rotted in the fields, trade routes fell silent, and ships drifted into ports with no living soul left aboard. In cities, the rhythm of life was replaced by the rhythm of death. Bells tolling non-stop, doors marked, families locked inside with their sick. Fear spread faster than the bacteria ever could. Neighbors stopped helping neighbors. Parents abandoned children. The healthy fled, if they could, carrying the infection with them to the next town, the next region, the next country. The first to disappear were often the very people meant to hold society together. Many trained physicians left early, escaping to the countryside. Clergy who were expected to comfort the dying died in huge numbers themselves after giving last rites to the infected. Authority thinned out. Hospitals overflowed. Order dissolved into desperation. And into that vacuum stepped a strange new figure, the plague doctor. They were not always the best physicians. Often they were young, inexperienced, or doctors of minor reputation who had little to lose and much to gain. Some had barely any formal medical training at all. But cities were so desperate that standards collapsed. Municipal councils offered large salaries, housing, and special privileges. The job description was brutally simple. Treat the sick, record the dead, supervise quarantines, and do what others were too afraid to do. It was less a medical position and more a contract with death. Everyone understood the truth. This was dangerous work, almost suicidal. Plague doctors walked directly into infected homes, touched the sick, examined the dying, and sometimes helped transport bodies. They entered spaces others fled from. Their pay was high not because they were miracle healers, but because they were expendable. They were the final line of contact between society and the abyss, hired not only to fight disease, but to impose some thin layer of order on chaos, to count the bodies, to witness the end, to make the catastrophe look, if only on paper, like something still under human control. Out of that nightmare emerged one of the most haunting figures in medical history. A silhouette that looked less like a healer and more like something pulled from folklore. The long coat, the gloves, the staff, and most famously, the bird-like mask. But this wasn't theater. It was one of the earliest attempts at what we would now recognize as biological protective equipment. The design is often attributed to Charles Delorme, physician to the French king Louis XIII around 1619. He proposed a standardized outfit for plague doctors, not just for appearance, but for survival. At a time when disease was still explained through the theory of miasma, the belief that illness spread through poisoned, foul-smelling air, protection meant blocking the body from corruption in the atmosphere. If death lived in the air, then the air itself had to be filtered. That is where the beak came in. The mask's long, curved nose, about 15 centimeters in length, was not meant to frighten, even if it did. It functioned like a primitive respirator. Inside, doctors packed a mixture of strong-smelling substances, dried flowers, rose petals, mint, myrrh, cloves, camphor, vinegar-soaked sponges, and dozens of other herbs and resins. Some accounts describe over 50 different ingredients. These weren't random choices. Many were known for their sharp aromas believed to purify corrupted air before it reached the lungs. The beak created a small chamber of clean air, at least by the science of the time, standing between the doctor and what they believed was death itself. The eyes were covered with glass lenses, turning the human face into something cold and unreadable. Medically, this was practical. The glass acted as a barrier against droplets, splashes, and contact, an early recognition that bodily fluids were dangerous. But superstition also played a role. Many believed disease could travel through a poisoned gaze, that even looking upon the infected could carry corruption. The glass shielded not only the eyes, but symbolically the soul. The rest of the outfit completed the transformation. A long coat made of heavy fabric or leather covered the body from neck to ankle. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat sealed a silhouette. Crucially, the clothing was coated in wax or oil. The idea was simple but surprisingly forward-thinking. Smooth, treated surfaces would prevent foul vapors, contaminated fluids, and bad smells from clinging to the fabric. In an era that did not understand bacteria, they still recognized contamination as something that could stick, linger, and follow you home. When fully dressed, the plague doctor looked less like a man and more like a walking barrier between worlds, between the living and the dying, the clean and the corrupted. They did not just wear protection, they became a symbol of fear, science, superstition, and survival, all fused into one unsettling shape. And yet, for all the strange armor and herbal filters, the plague doctor did not walk empty-handed. What completed the image and made it even more unsettling was the small collection of tools he carried, objects that blurred the line between medicine, authority, and ritual. Most iconic was the wooden staff. Long, rigid, and always kept between doctor and patient, it served first as distance, a movable boundary in a world where touch could mean death. With it, a doctor could lift a blanket, roll a body slightly, or gesture without direct contact. He could point to where a patient should lie, signal assistance, or direct the removal of a corpse, all while keeping his gloved hands away from potentially contaminated skin. But the staff was more than a medical tool. In the chaos of plague-ridden cities, fear made people unpredictable. The sick might cling, beg, or lash out in desperation. Families could panic at the sight of officials taking loved ones away. The staff gave the doctor space, and if needed, a means of defense. It was authority in physical form, a symbol that this figure, however ghostly he appeared, represented the city's law and last line of order. In some places, medicine and morality were still deeply intertwined. Illness was often seen as punishment, a sign of divine anger. There are accounts suggesting that plague doctors or those working under religious influence used the staff to prod or even strike patients, believing physical suffering could drive out sin along with disease. To modernize, it seems cruel. To that era, it could be framed as desperate spiritual intervention in a world where science had few answers. Then there were the cutting tools. simple knives, lancets, and crude scalpels tucked into leather pouches. Their purpose was tied to one of the most terrifying features of the plague, the swollen lymph nodes known as buboes, painful, dark masses that appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. Physicians believed these swellings trapped poisonous humors that needed to be released, so they cut. Without anesthesia, without sterilization as we understand it, and with only basic knowledge of anatomy, doctors would lance the buboes, hoping to drain the corruption from the body. Pus and blood flowed. Sometimes the pressure eased. Sometimes the patient died anyway. The tools were often wiped, heated, or rinsed in vinegar, believed to cleanse them. It was a fragile barrier between life and overwhelming infection, and many physicians likely carried the disease from one body to another without realizing it. So, the plague doctor moved through the streets as a strange fusion of healer, official, and omen. Staff in one hand, blades at his side, hidden behind glass eyes and a beaked mask filled with flowers, he practiced a medicine caught between superstition and emerging logic. Every gesture, every tool, revealed the same truth. Humanity was trying to fight an invisible enemy with whatever it had: belief, ritual, courage, and just enough science to glimpse the future, but not yet reach it. And when it came to treatment, desperation often overpowered reason, pushing medicine into territory that now feels closer to nightmare than healing. The logic of the time was built on humors, vapors, and poisons imagined to move through the body like invisible smoke, and so the cures were designed to pull corruption out, to lure it away, to drive it from the flesh by force. A live frog might be pressed against a swollen plague bubo, held there as the patient writhed, because it was believed the animal would draw the poison into itself. If the frog died or burst, it was taken as proof that the toxin had been absorbed, even as the infection inside the human body raged on untouched. Other remedies crossed the line from strange to horrifying. After a boil was cut or burned open, mixtures of human waste, crushed onions, herbs, and even fragments of snakeskin could be packed into the wound, the stench and sting interpreted as signs that the treatment was working, while in reality, bacteria were being given new pathways deeper into the bloodstream. Bloodletting, already common in earlier medicine, became even more extreme under the shadow of plague. Physicians convinced that illness came from an imbalance of bodily fluids would open veins again and again, draining already feverish, dehydrated patients until they grew pale, weak, and sometimes slipped quietly into death. To the doctor, the fading pulse could still be explained as the disease being too strong, not the cure being too violent. Pain itself was woven into the belief system. Suffering meant the body was fighting, that something was being expelled. In truth, many of these interventions did not just fail to help, they added trauma, blood loss, and new infections to bodies that were already losing a battle they did not understand. These practices were not born from cruelty for its own sake, but from a tragic mismatch between confidence and knowledge. The doctors were acting within the best frameworks they had, yet those frameworks were built on foundations that would not be replaced for centuries. The result was a grim chapter where treatment and torment blurred together, and where the line between trying to save a life and unintentionally shortening it became almost impossible to see. But as the plague dragged on and fear replaced order, a darker reality grew in the shadow of those black cloaks and beaked masks. The plague doctor was supposed to be a servant of the city, a barrier between the living and the dead. Yet in a time when law was weakened, records were chaotic, and entire neighborhoods were dying in silence, power became easy to abuse, and some did. Desperation made medicine a marketplace. Cities paid plague doctors high wages because few others would accept what was essentially a slow gamble with death. But beyond official salaries, another economy flourished, one built on terror. Wealthy families, terrified of quarantine, of their homes being sealed, of their possessions burned to purify infection, would offer money, jewelry, deeds, anything to avoid being marked. A single chalk symbol on a door could mean isolation, starvation, or social ruin. Some doctors, holding the authority to report cases, could delay, soften, or reinterpret symptoms for a price. What passed as examination sometimes became negotiation. For the poor, the story was often colder. With limited resources and too many dying, treatment could become selective. Those who could not pay might receive only a glance, a prayer, or a token remedy, vinegar, herbs, bloodletting, while attention flowed toward those whose survival had financial value. In such a world, healing and profit could become tangled, and compassion competed with self-preservation. Not every plague doctor was corrupt, but the system itself made exploitation frighteningly possible. Even death had a price. Official records determined what happened to a body and a house. If a death was labeled plague-related, strict measures could follow: property sealed, goods destroyed, families displaced. But if another cause was written, fever, lung illness, or natural causes, consequences might be avoided. In cities drowning in mortality, oversight was thin. A bribe slipped into a gloved hand could change ink on paper, and ink could change a family's fate. Statistics bent quietly while the carts of corpses kept rolling. Then there was the gray zone between medicine and anatomy. Universities and surgeons hungered for bodies to study. Knowledge of the human body was still limited, and plague provided grim opportunity. While not all plague doctors were involved, the era itself saw illegal dissections, bodies taken without consent, graves disturbed. In times when the dead outnumbered the living in some districts, the boundary between necessary study and grave robbery blurred. Disease filled the streets. Science, still young and ruthless in its curiosity, sometimes followed too closely behind. So, alongside courage and genuine effort, there existed greed, coercion, and moral collapse. The plague did not just infect lungs and blood, it infected systems, choices, and consciences. Under the mask of protection, humanity showed two faces at once, one trying to save life with the little knowledge it had, and another exploiting chaos, proving that when death becomes ordinary, ethics can become fragile. And here lies one of history's most chilling ironies. The very outfit designed to keep death away may have helped carry it forward. For centuries, people believed plague spread through miasma, poisonous air rising from rot and filth, and the plague doctor's suit was built around that idea. Thick, waxed leather to block foul vapors, a mask stuffed with fragrant herbs to filter the air, gloves, boots, every inch sealed against invisible corruption. To the people of the time, it looked like science. To us, it looks like a tragic misunderstanding wrapped in confidence. Because the true culprit was not the air, it was the flea. Tiny, nearly invisible, riding on rats that thrived in crowded, dirty cities, fleas carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis in their guts. When their rodent hosts died, they searched for new blood, human blood. They could cling to fabric, hide in seams, nest in warm folds of clothing. And what was the plague doctor wearing? Layers of heavy material, rarely washed in a meaningful way, worn from house to house, street to street, bed to bed. The suit that felt like armor was in another sense a moving habitat, warm, dark, textured, perfect for parasites. Each visit to a sick room meant close contact with bedding, clothing, and bodies already swarming with fleas. The doctor would lean in, examine buboes, touch linens, sit beside the dying, all while believing the waxed coat and gloves formed an invisible shield. Then he would step back into the street, into the next home, into the next desperate family, carrying more than herbs in his beak. He was not just a witness to death. Unknowingly, he could become a bridge. This does not mean plague doctors caused the Black Death or even understood what they were spreading. They were operating with the best framework available to them, a model of disease built on smell, rot, and air. But the cruel twist is that their confidence may have made movement easier. A terrified neighbor might avoid a sick house, a family might shut its doors, but the plague doctor was expected to go in and out, over and over again. Authority gave him access, duty gave him mobility, and mobility is exactly what an epidemic needs. So the figure that symbolized protection may, in some cases, have been part of the chain of transmission, a walking paradox, healer in intention, vector in reality. Under the beaked mask was a human trying to fight an invisible enemy with the wrong map of the world. The tragedy is not just that people died, it is that they trusted what looked like progress, while the true mechanics of disease moved quietly beneath cloth, leather, and certainty. Over time, the image outlived the epidemic. The long beak, the glass eyes, the dark cloak sweeping the ground, all of it slipped out of hospital corridors and into culture. What once walked through real streets heavy with the smell of sickness slowly transformed into theater. In festivals and carnivals, especially in places like Venice, the mask became costume. In films, novels, and video games, the figure turned into an omen, a creature of horror, something closer to death itself than to a doctor. The silhouette is too perfect, too dramatic to fade away. A human shape twisted just enough to feel inhuman. It tops into something ancient, the fear of disease you cannot see and the stranger who walks calmly through it. But that transformation hides a quieter truth. Behind the frightening outline was not a monster, but a person working with the wrong science and the right intention. They stood at a strange crossroads in history, when medicine was shedding superstition but had not yet found microbes, bacteria, or germ theory. Their methods seem misguided now, almost theatrical, yet within them were the early outlines of ideas that define modern public health: isolation of the sick, special clothing for those exposed to contagion, controlled interaction instead of chaos. They were, in a crude and incomplete way, trying to build a system, a barrier between illness and the rest of society. The plague doctor represents a stage of medicine that is easy to mock and easy to fear, but harder to understand. He reminds us that progress is not a straight line from ignorance to knowledge. It is a series of desperate guesses, partial insights, and bold attempts made in the dark. Sometimes those attempts help. Sometimes they accidentally make things worse, but without them, the later breakthroughs never come. So the next time you see the beaked mask in a movie, a game, or a Halloween display, pause for a moment. Do not see only horror. See the human story inside it. A time when death moved through cities like weather, when explanations were fragile, and when people still stepped forward anyway, covered head to toe, believing they could stand between the living and an invisible enemy. The mask was not born as a symbol of evil, it was born as a shield, however imperfect, forged from fear, hope, and the stubborn refusal to do nothing while the world was burning.